to the Bible Source Text Podcast. We are going to really begin to delve into Scripture today. We're going to start here with Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and desolate emptiness, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning one day. So the opening phrase here, in the beginning, that is, if you'll recall in my previous episode, that is the title of the Hebrew text. And so we start with this phrase, in the beginning, God created. The book assumes the eternal preexistence of God, and it assumes that God is creating time and space itself here, that God already existed. This phrase, beginning, actually refers to the entire creation period, not just a single moment in time. This isn't the beginning as in the beginning of the timeline. It's the beginning as in the period of time at the start. So we've got here, the start of everything. This beginning period, this creation period. Now, the name that is used here for God is the term Elohim in Hebrew. And this is a very interesting term. It is a word used throughout the Torah as one of the names of God. This is sort of the part of the documentary hypothesis. The Elohist source comes from whichever source is using this name of Elohim. Elohim is a plural word, but it is grammatically treated as singular. So we've got a singular name here that is nonetheless a plural word. Why? Now the Christian answer to that, often common Christian answer, is that this is a reference to the Trinity. That God is, while Christianity is monotheistic, we believe in one God. The idea that God is not singular, he's Trinitarian. There are some other sort of nuances to this term being used here. El was used by the Israelites and the Canaanites as a sort of general term for a god. Think of, in English, God with a lowercase g. But it was also used as a proper name for a specific god. It was the Canaanites worshipped a god that they referred to as El, but obviously there was the major difference that the Israelites were monotheists, the Canaanites were polytheists. So the Bible uses both Elohim and Yahweh as names for God. This is, as I said before, part of the basis for the documentary hypothesis is these two different names being used. The Canaanites actually did worship El and Yahweh as two separate entities, alongside all the other gods in their pantheon. Some have actually taken this to mean, have argued that the Israelites took these two Canaanite gods and combined them together, and then down the line developed into monotheism. Personally, I don't find the evidence for that extremely compelling. It is not completely unreasonable of an idea, but just from the really the lack of sources, the small number of sources that are out there for this, I think you could ask the question, why not assume that the Canaanites started worshiping the Israelite God, but in a polytheistic understanding, eventually splitting that into two gods? We don't have a lot of sources on Yahweh worship among the Canaanites, for example. So, all in all, the name choices, the choices of names that are used for God in the Torah, it's a very interesting topic of study. We will delve into that more, especially later on when the term Yahweh starts to get used. But for now, understand this creation narrative is using the term Elohim. The text says that the earth is formless and desolate. Terms used here are the same terms you'd use for a desolate wasteland or a desert. The idea is that it's useless, it's uninhabited, it has no positive values, no function or purpose. And that's an important point to make too. The language here in this Genesis narrative focuses far more on purpose than on physical form. And you see that a lot in ancient Near Eastern texts. A lot of Mesopotamian mythology, their creation narratives focus on what's the purpose of this thing, not necessarily focusing on it being created itself. In Mesopotamian mythology, naming something is what gives it a role or a purpose. Point is that debating over literalism and what's symbolic, what's literal, were there 6 days of creation, literally is a day, an age, all of that stuff. is kind of misguided. You're kind of approaching the text wrong. You're not approaching the text the way its authors would have approached it. And so we need to look through this and determine, what is this saying about the purpose of the world and the purpose of the things that are being created? We start here with an assumption of sort of primordial waters, which is again another very common motif seen in ancient Near Eastern stories. But we also see some key differences here. Egyptian and Mesopotamian mythologies both personified chaos, and water and darkness is associated with chaos. So you end up with these conflicts between land and water, light and darkness, order and chaos. And often violent conflict between the gods trying to impose order on the darkness and the water, and sometimes the forces of chaos in the water and darkness fighting back. Here what we see in this story is just God speaks and the chaos gives way to order. There's no conflict because none can oppose an omnipotent God. When God says, let there be something in this, you have to understand also that's a command. He's not requesting. He's not saying, let me do this. He is commanding it. He is saying, this is what is happening. So that's very much the message here. God commands creation to happen, and it happens. What God states to be true is true. One possible analog, or at least comparison, in another ancient Near Eastern culture would be the Egyptian god Ptah speaking to create other gods. In Egyptian mythology, Ptah would speak the names of other gods and they would appear. But again, there are some key differences in how that's interpreted. The Egyptian god's ability to speak things into existence is more relative. It's sort of like a superpower that some gods have, and also had connotations associating it with creativity among mortals. Similar language was used there for artisans having an idea and then creating it. That's very different from the vibe here in Genesis. God's omnipotence simply allows him to command that things exist, and they exist. So while that is on the surface similar, what's being communicated and the point that it's trying to make is very different. Moving on to verse 6. Then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Let it separate the waters from the waters. God made the expanse and separated the waters that were below the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning a second day. So there was this assumption throughout the ancient world of water existing above a firmament. And there's a reference here to a water above the sky. You know, the ancient Egyptians, the sun god would ride in a boat across the sky. There are references in ancient Mesopotamian cultures to Marduk controlling where the water is, including holding back those heavenly waters. So this is, again, a common motif. And we see this here with God separating those expanses. In ancient Egypt, separating two things was what gave those two things distinction. Egyptians kind of, I guess it's more Egyptian philosophy, kind of believed that you could define things based on what they were, but also based on what they were not, by separating them out into different categories. A mythological connection might be Nut and Geb being separated by Shu, that's the earth god, and the sky goddess being separated by the god of the air. And so you have kind of a similar function here of God separating the waters apart from each other and creating the heavens. Moving on to verse 9, God said, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place. Let dry land appear, and it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called the seas. And God saw that it was good. If the waters represent chaos, you've got chaos being pushed out, order being gathered together. This was another common motif. The Egyptians had the primordial mound, the Ben, rising out of the primordial waters of Nu. Mesopotamians also had Marduk gathering waters into one place. So again, these are very common motifs being used here. And then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit according to their kind with seed in them. And it was so. The earth produced vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their kind, trees bearing fruit with seed in them according to their kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning a third day. We've got here plants being given purpose. Could this be a reference even to early agriculture? Possibly. God is creating the plants for food. That's not referenced in this verse, but it will be referenced here in a few verses. That plants are created for food for mankind and animals. Very interesting contrast to other ancient Near Eastern myths where often the gods would create humans to provide them food. Instead of God creating humans to serve him food, he is feeding his creation by creating the plants. So that is a very interesting contrast. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and they shall serve as signs for seasons and for days and years. They shall serve as lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, a 4th day. So the lights here are given a purpose to serve as signs of seasons, mark days and years. Unlike most ancient Near Eastern myths, the lights themselves, the sun, moon, and stars, are not personified. They're not given any sort of personification. There's not a sun god that represents the sun, but they are still given a purpose. I'm kind of going to be dating this episode in this sense, but we recently had, across large portions of the United States, a solar eclipse, and I thought of this verse during that. Solar eclipses are a major way that we can date historical events. The ancient Egyptians, for example, actually marked their years based on the reign of a certain king in the 5th year of King Ramesses II's reign. That's how they dated things. They didn't have really numbered years. But because solar eclipses are predictable, and are notable events that often got written down, if we can sort of get events close to a solar eclipse that would have been visible there, something we can figure out what date certain events took place on, and then expand the calendar from there. That is why there are some open questions in ancient history as far as dates go. Sometimes there will be multiple dates for a specific event. But I thought of this verse when the eclipse was happening, thinking, the purpose God gives to the sun and moon is to serve as sort of a calendar, in a sense, to be able to count days and years. And historians to this day do that. We figure out ancient historical events based on the lights in the sky, as it says. Then God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." God created the great sea creatures, every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed, according to their kind, every winged bird according to its kind. God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, a 5th day. Sea creatures are actually a common motif in ancient Near Eastern myths as well, but they were often personified, and they were often personifications of the forces of chaos that needed to be overcome to impose order. The Canaanites had Lotan, who was defeated by Baal-Hadad. The Mesopotamians had Tiamat, who was defeated by Marduk. And the Egyptians had Apep, who was fought every night by Ra on his solar barge. All of those were forces of chaos, associated again with chaos, darkness, water, being defeated by a god in violent combat. Here, again, in contrast, you see these sea creatures themselves, whatever these creatures were, whether they're supposed to be some sort of sea monster to symbolize chaos, or whether they're, whales and sharks and things, actual sea creatures. The point is that they are created by God with a purpose. Moving on to 24. Then God said, "Let the earth produce living creatures according to their kind, livestock and crawling things, and animals of the earth according to their kind." And it was so. God made the animals of the earth according to their kind, the livestock according to their kind, and everything that crawls at the ground according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. Similar to the birds and fish and sea creatures, we see animals being given a purpose. Verse 26, "And then God said, Let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every crawling thing that crawls on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Then God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you. And to every animal of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day. So, as I mentioned in our first couple of verses, there's God is using plural pronouns here, just like how Elohim is the plural of El. It's used to describe the singular God. God says, "Let us make mankind in our image." And again, most Christians interpret that as describing the relationships within the Godhead. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, all present and all participating in creation, all in agreement. One really important consequence of that is the idea that God did not need to create humans for relationships. He already had relationships within himself. Through the doctrine of the Trinity, we can sort of understand that. But again, that contrasts with a lot of other ancient Near Eastern creation narratives where the gods are creating mankind to meet some sort of need that they have. Here, God does not have needs to meet, and not even a need for relationship, but he creates humans instead for the purpose of displaying his omnipotence and to help to rule over the sky. This idea of mankind being created in God's image is a very evocative symbol in ancient Near Eastern culture, because the language used there is similar to the language that's used to describe an idol in a temple that was thought to represent a god. And so you get this image of, no pun intended there, you get an analogy, a metaphor almost, of the creation itself being the temple, and of mankind sort of representing God within that temple in the same way that images represented gods in human-made temples. So that's actually a very powerful statement, a very powerful verse to those who wrote it down in the Bronze Age. And so we have all these elements that are contrasting with other ancient accounts. You've got, that the assumption that God simply exists. Most other ancient Near Eastern myths explain the creation of the gods, but not so here. God is simply pre-existent. He simply is. You've got God imposing order on chaos, but you don't have an attempt by chaos to resist like you do in a lot of ancient myths, because God is in control and is uniquely powerful, is uniquely omnipotent. You've got, rather than there being some sort of conflict that leads to these things being created or some creative process, God simply states that creation exists, and it exists. We could potentially here talk about the Logos. The Logos being an old sort of ancient philosophical idea of God's sort of creative action within the world. Christianity has always maintained that Jesus is this Logos. It's God's creative action entering into the creation. Judaism, a lot of the ancient Jewish scholars talked about, the firstborn of God or the angel of the Lord as possibly being the Logos. We'll see the phrase angel of the Lord appearing later in Genesis. The Gnostics identified that as the demiurge, a sort of a servant of God who created creation. But in Christianity, we see the Logos, the word that brings creative action into the world, as being Jesus. That comes from the first chapter of the book of John. What we've got here in this source, in Genesis, in this Genesis narrative, is that God cares for mankind and creates mankind specifically, and that God puts mankind in a rulership role over creation. The language that's used there is actually similar to language that's used for kings in some other ancient Near Eastern sources, but here it's applied over all of mankind, the idea being that all of mankind is ruling over creation in a sort of role subservient to God, but in dominion over the rest of creation. We're, by being made in God's image, that applies. Mankind is capable of embodying some of God's attributes: love, intellect, will, emotion, moral reasoning. Personhood itself, the very idea of being a person, is something that is a unique attribute shared by both God and man. Mankind is capable of forming relationships with each other and with God, which again creates a unique relationship that's not shared by other parts of creation. So when this verse tells us that mankind is made in God's image, understanding that through sort of the ancient mind makes it that much more impactful to really understand what all that implies and the implications that carries. Next episode, we will go into Genesis chapter 2, where we'll get a little more detail about the creation of man and get into Adam and Eve in that. So thank you for joining me here today, and see you next time.